What is going on, guys? It is the Coaster Battleman here, bringing you an awesome video. The top 15 roller coasters at Cedar Point. I recently went to this park and I was blown away by the roller coasters. Only a few coasters I was disappointed with, but these are the top 15 coasters at Cedar Point. Pipe Scream is not included, but I would love to put it on this list. Yes, in my opinion, Pipe Scream is better than a few of these coasters, but it's technically not a roller coaster, so let's move on. Number 15 is Cedar Creek Mine Ride. This is the mine train of the park, and it is kind of small and a little rough, so that's why it's at number 15. And to me, besides the one drop during the ride, you go right over the water, the ride just meanders around the course. Number 14 is Corkscrew. This is the first coaster to feature 3 inversions, and that's the best part of this ride. That first vertical loop is very good, and the only vertical loop on this ride. The double corkscrew's alright, it's just okay in my opinion, but the beginning of the ride, after that first drop that's not so steep, there's an airtime hill that is very rough and not that enjoyable. And there is some parts of this coaster that are pretty rough, but the inversions are pretty good, which is the reason why it's at number 14. Number 13 is Blue Streak. Now, a lot of people could put this a lot higher on this list, maybe at number 10 or number 9, but I wasn't really a fan of this coaster. I was disappointed by Blue Streak, and I thought it would be one of my favorite coasters at Cedar Point going into the top 10. But this coaster was rough and not that enjoyable in my opinion. But the airtime was amazing on this ride. I really like Blue Streak's airtime, but other than that, this coaster isn't that great, and I think it needs a retrack by GCI. But I totally understand why this coaster is rough. It's pretty old, so yeah. Number 12 is the other wooden coaster at Cedar Point, Mean Streak. Most people would consider Blue Streak better than Mean Streak, but I only got to ride Mean Streak once when I was at Cedar Point, and it was okay actually. I really enjoyed this coaster. Not really enjoyed, but I enjoyed it a little bit. The drop was okay, but it was trimmed, so that kind of stunk. But I was in the front row, which meant it was a pretty good ride. The turns were alright. It was just kind of a boring layout. This coaster is okay in the front row, as you can see everything and stuff, but this ride really does need a better layout. If it was retracked by GCI, at least it would be smoother, but if this coaster was renovated by RMC, because I saw the dots that were on the supports, that meant that RMC would come in and renovate this coaster soon, like in 2017 or something. I think that Mean Streak desperately needs to be RMC'd, kind of like with Blue Streak, but I think Blue Streak needs to be replaced by a GCI. Number 11 is Iron Dragon. This is the final coaster on this list not final coaster, but final coaster that's not in the top 10 at Cedar Point, in my opinion. This coaster kind of meanders around the course. This coaster has a good ending when it goes over the lake, but the rest of the ride kind of meanders around. After that first drop, it meanders around until the second lift hill, and then it becomes kind of intense, kind of not, and then, yeah. This coaster doesn't really have a good layout like the Bat at Kings Island, and I could go either way of which coaster's better, because the Bat is just too short, but this ride's a nice long ride. Now let's get into the top 10. Number 10 is Magnum XL200, the first ever hypercoaster. Out of all the hypercoasters I've ridden, this is the worst one I've ridden. I prefer the B&M Hyper Run roller coasters better, but this coaster wasn't that bad. The first time I rode it, it was terrible when I rode it, and I wasn't sitting in the middle row of any car. I've heard from Coaster Stream, which is a YouTuber I'm subscribed to. He said that if you're in the middle row of any car, you'll have an enjoyable experience. And the next two times I rode it, I enjoyed Magnum. But overall, I think this coaster's alright. It's not terrible, but it's not the greatest. Number 9 is Raptor. The reason why I really like this coaster is because of its intensity. I really like the intensity of this ride. But that Cobra Roll, man, that Cobra Roll's pretty bad. Kind of like in Vertigo's Cobra Roll or whatever Cobra Rolls are on roller coasters. But this coaster had a strong layout, in my opinion. It was kind of rough for a B&M invert, but still, this ride is very intense, and I rode it 3 times when I was at Cedar Point, and I really enjoyed my experience in the front row. Number 8 is Wicked Twister. I really like Wicked Twister. I think it's an underrated coaster at Cedar Point. Like when you go up to some coasters like Maverick, there's a long line for them, but for Wicked Twister, the lines usually aren't that long for it. And this coaster is very fun, and it's actually fairly intense when you twist around those twisting sections, which is the reason why Wicked Twister is at number 8. And I personally like Wicked Twister better than V2 Vertical Velocity. And this coaster is right next to the beach, and overall it's a solid ride. Number 7 is Rougarou, the B&M Floorless Coaster, formerly the stand-up coaster Mantis. This coaster's okay, in my opinion. I thought it would be a lot better, but I was kind of disappointed with this coaster. I really like Rougarou, don't get me wrong, but I think it is an overrated coaster. Because it is, after the first few inversions, like that vertical loop, which is definitely the best part of this ride, and that dive loop, which is okay, and then the incline loop, which was pretty good. After that mid-course brake run, that corkscrew at the ending is not that great, but I really like Rougarou. I think it's a pretty good ride. It's just that ending that kind of stinks, but still. It is a bit of an older B&M coaster, so yeah. Number 6 is Gemini. Wow, a family coaster. Some people consider this ride a family coaster, but in my opinion, it is kind of a family coaster, but I would call it a combo coaster because the stats are pretty good, and this coaster is actually a very fun coaster to watch as it is to ride. I really liked racing the other side on Gemini, and I got to ride the blue side once and the red side twice when I went on Gemini, and I really like this coaster. It's one of my favorite aerodynamics coasters, and overall, this is a very fun coaster. I recommend you ride it a few times when you're at Cedar Point, especially once on the red side and once on the blue side. And number 5 is Gatekeeper. Now we're in the Fantastic Five, in my opinion. I love Gatekeeper. This is an underrated B&M wing coaster. Some people hate this ride or hate on this ride because it's not that great. The airtime hill in the middle of the ride is kind of pointless, but I actually got airtime on that airtime hill. Unlike Corkscrew's airtime hill where you meant to get airtime, Gatekeeper, you got some great hang time on the wing over drop. The inversions are amazing. But when the mid-course brake run happens, I think this coaster is kind of lame towards the end with the helix, but still, I really like this coaster and it has a strong layout, and it is kind of forceful in my opinion. And I love the hang time is what is the reason why you should ride this. And now, number 4 is Top Thrill Dragster. I love Top Thrill Dragster. This coaster is intense. That launch is so powerful. I rode this coaster at night, front row, and I got covered in bugs on it. It was amazing. You get nailed at speeds of 120 miles per hour by getting hit by some bugs, depending on what time of the day you go on this ride. But this coaster is huge. This is the tallest coaster I've ridden at 420 feet. This coaster is the fastest coaster I've ridden. But this coaster could have had a few extra elements, maybe an ejector airtime hill maybe, or maybe a massive double helix. Maybe like an airtime hill, double helix, and brakes, but still, this coaster is amazing. I love the theme for this ride, and this coaster definitely has the best theming out of any coaster at Cedar Point. Number 3 is Valraven. Now, this coaster is my favorite dive coaster. I know I was hanging out with a group of people like the Coaster Kids, which it was. I got to hang out with Coaster Kids the second day I was at Cedar Point, July 7th. And I know that Coaster Fanatic, which he was there, he told me that Valraven, he didn't like it as much as Griffin because of you didn't really get hanged below the drop for that long or whatever, but this coaster is amazing. I love the inversions on this ride, and this coaster could be a bit longer, but still, I love Valraven. It's an amazing coaster. I love the logo for this ride, and overall, this ride is very good, and it's one of my favorite dive coasters, or my favorite dive coaster ever. Number 2 is Maverick, and this coaster is amazing. This coaster has some amazing ejector airtime, 2 ejector moments, and this coaster has some intense bank turns. The restraints are amazing on this ride, in my opinion, but it is kind of cramped when you're in the car, so I recommend you cross your legs, which I did, and the ride was a bit better. And this coaster has one of my favorite launches, especially towards nighttime or during nighttime. You go through that dark tunnel and you can't see a single thing at night, and then you just launch out. And there's some really intense bank turns on this ride. This ride's all about the ejector air and turns, and overall, this is an amazing ride. But what could be number 1? Millennium Force. This coaster is so good. That drop is outstanding. And I prefer this coaster in the back row over the front row because I think probably because Coaster Studios said it was forceless is uh, because he rode the front row. But if you go in the back row, oh my gosh, this coaster is intense. You gray out on that first overbank. I love the overbank turns, and that airtime is amazing. I love Millennium Force's airtime. It's the best airtime I've ever been on. I love Millennium Force, and it's my number 1 coaster I've ridden for now. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more videos.